He had intended only a brief stroll, a walk to shake off the stubborn fog of his workday, but Zephyr City had a way of convincing humans that a quick jaunt could last for hours. Neon signs hummed overhead in colors he didn't have names for, and the wet streets reflected them like pools of liquid rainbow. He cursed softly at his own shoes, which insisted on squelching with every step, and wondered if he was going to be late for dinner, or more accurately, if he'd remember where he parked his anti-gravity scooter. That thought alone made him groan. Humans were absurdly bad at navigating floating vehicles without colliding spectacularly with the occasionally aggressive cleaning drones. A sudden pinging sound distracted him as he rounded a corner. A small metallic sphere hovered midair, its surface flickering with tiny messages in a script that looked vaguely like cursive crossed with circuitry. He swatted at it instinctively, and the sphere dodged neatly, almost like it had a sense of humor. "Hey, watch it, I'm not a fly," he muttered, and the sphere replied with a blinking sequence that resembled laughter. He laughed too, because what else could you do when confronted with a teasing piece of AI that clearly had more personality than your last 5 coworkers combined? Then he saw her. She was standing by the entrance of a building that looked like a cross between a modern art sculpture and a hovering observatory. Her long ears caught the neon glow in ways that made them shimmer faintly, and they twitched almost imperceptibly when she tilted her head. She smiled in a way that made him instantly aware of how clumsy he looked, shoulders hunched, eyebrows a little too high, probably tripping over invisible cracks in the street. "Lost?" she asked, her voice carrying a melody that felt unnatural, like it had been tuned to resonate just slightly above the mundane hum of human speech. I was just walking," he said, and immediately felt ridiculous. Humans never sounded so timid in movies when they stumbled upon aliens, but this was real life, and he was a mess of nervous energy and mild awe. "You don't look like you walk much," she said, stepping aside with a flourish that sent a small drone spinning in circles above her shoulder. "Mostly flailing, if I'm honest." Her ears twitched again, and he had to resist the urge to stare, which was only made harder by the faint glow of the city reflecting off her slightly iridescent hair. He tried to joke, because humor felt like the only currency he had in this strange encounter. "Flailing counts as cardio, right?" He smiled weakly, fully aware that it was probably a terrible attempt at charm. Her laughter was soft but genuine, and the sound made him forget for a second that he was standing on a street where gravity was optional and streetlights hovered at random angles. "Sure," she said, tilting her head. "Cardio is definitely one word for it. Come on, then. You look like you could use a seat that doesn't fight back." Before he could protest, she moved with a fluidity that suggested gravity and air were mere suggestions, not rules, and opened the door to her home. The inside was a delightful contradiction, familiar enough that he didn't panic, but utterly alien in every conceivable way. The furniture appeared conventional until he realized some pieces floated inches off the ground, orbiting a central point, as if obeying some unspoken celestial rhythm. Holographic panels projected art that shifted constantly, images of impossible landscapes, cities wrapped in rings of glowing clouds, creatures that flickered between forms so fast his brain couldn't keep up. He tried to keep his voice steady. "This is quite a place." "It's my corner of chaos," she said, plopping onto a floating chair with the ease of someone who had trained her body to defy physics since birth. Her ears twitched again, almost like antennae picking up amusement frequencies. "Most humans tip over if you hand them a cup of tea here. Don't spill anything important. We don't have insurance for quantum fruit stains." He followed her to a couch that hovered just a foot off the ground. Sitting down felt like attempting to negotiate with a mild levitation field. He ended up tilting slightly to the left and caught himself with an awkward hand gesture. She snorted in amusement. "Smooth," she said. "You might survive a week here, maybe, if you stop breathing too loudly." Tea appeared in his hand without her moving toward a table. He blinked. Thanks." You're welcome, though technically the cup brought itself. I just suggested it exist. Tiny loopholes in space-time hospitality, she said, tilting the cup as though it were alive. The liquid inside glowed faintly, pulsating softly like a heartbeat. He sipped cautiously. It was tangy, sweet, and somehow reminded him of peaches, honey, and a memory he couldn't place. "It's good," he said, eyes widening. "Of course it's good," she said with a smirk. "I wouldn't let you poison yourself before you even understand the quantum ethics of a home visit." He laughed, more relaxed than he'd been in hours. She leaned back, and her ears flopped in a way that made her look simultaneously elegant and mischievous. "So," she said, "you're here now. Do you have questions, or are you just going to keep flailing in wonder?" He hesitated, then chuckled. "I guess I have a lot of questions, starting with, why am I here? Why are you hosting me?" Her eyes sparkled, and she tapped a finger on the couch so that it spun lightly in orbit around the central field. Why do humans ask questions like that? Sometimes things just happen. Sometimes people invite others over because they like the company. You seem interesting. That's reason enough. He considered pointing out that interesting might be the vaguest invitation in history, but she interrupted his thought with a small joke about gravity-defying slippers, and he laughed again, nearly spilling his glowing tea. Somehow, despite the strangeness, the humor, and the floating furniture, he felt a warmth settle into him, a strange, human kind of comfort. By the time he realized the hours had slipped past without him noticing, she had told him stories of her travels through nebulae, her encounters with cities that sang in electromagnetic waves, and creatures whose forms constantly shifted like living holograms. She punctuated each tale with jokes about how humans would never survive such chaos, her ears twitching in delight every time he laughed. He realized he didn't mind being lost, because being here, being with her, made the impossible seem less daunting. When he finally admitted he should probably leave, she raised an eyebrow, ears quivering in mock disapproval. "Leave already, but the sofa isn't even tired of you yet." He grinned, shrugging, aware that the moment he stepped out into the chaotic neon of Zephyr City, something subtle had changed. He wasn't just a wandering human anymore. He was someone welcomed into an alien home, into laughter that could bend the rules of physics, into an unexpected, inexplicable connection that promised even stranger adventures ahead. And maybe, he thought, that was exactly the point. The next morning, he found himself awake not because of an alarm, but because the light in her home seemed to move on its own, stretching and twisting across the walls like a living thing. He squinted at it, trying to make sense of the colors, and caught sight of her hovering near the kitchen, her long ears twitching as she inspected a floating toaster that had somehow achieved sentience overnight. She gave him a sharp, playful look. "Morning, don't just lie there. The toast will burn itself if you don't intervene." He stumbled out of the gravity-optional bed and tried to follow her instructions, only to discover that the toaster wasn't so much a device as a tiny autonomous kitchen companion. It zipped around, ejecting slices of bread midair, and one of them almost collided with his head before he managed a clumsy deflection. She laughed, a sound that seemed to tangle with the very air, making him grin despite his exhaustion. "You're surprisingly good at dodging carbohydrates," she said, and he realized that even in moments of minor danger, she had a way of making him feel like an explorer on a game show. Breakfast was a chaotic affair. He attempted to pour juice from a bottle that hovered and rotated of its own accord, and instead of spilling it on the counter, the liquid formed a small glowing arc that hovered in front of him for a moment before retreating as if mocking his technique. She clapped her hands once and the juice obediently landed in a cup. "Humans," she said, shaking her head with mock pity. "So fragile, so easily humored by glowing liquids." He laughed and muttered, "You make it sound like a superpower." After breakfast, she decided it was time for a proper introduction to her world. She led him to a balcony that extended beyond the conventional limits of the building, seemingly suspended in midair with nothing beneath. He held onto the railing, or what he thought was a railing, while she floated beside him, casually gesturing toward the cityscape below. Hovering vehicles zipped through streams of neon light, their trajectories occasionally bending in ways that defied Newtonian expectations. "Try not to scream if a grav lift fails," she quipped, ears flicking with amusement. They ventured through her home as she demonstrated subtle technologies that seemed like magic to him. Walls that were simultaneously transparent and reflective, furniture that anticipated a person's movements and shifted accordingly, and holographic screens that could project themselves anywhere within the room. She joked about how humans had to invent doors because they lacked telekinetic intuition, and he couldn't stop laughing when he accidentally walked into a floating screen, earning a dry, "Bravo, you're an innovator in collision theory." But despite the humor, there was an undercurrent of something else. She paused mid-step, her ears angled in a way he couldn't decipher, and looked at him as if she could see a hidden thought he hadn't spoken. "You're curious," she said softly, almost teasingly, "but careful. Humans tend to overthink when faced with the wrong questions." He tried to respond, but the words tangled in his mouth, so he opted for laughter instead. She laughed with him, not at him, and he realized that it was the kind of laughter that invited trust without demanding it. They floated, or walked, depending on gravity, through a private garden that seemed to exist in defiance of space itself. Plants with luminous leaves twisted gently in the air, and small, floating insects, bioluminescent, with translucent wings, buzzed around them like sentient fireflies. He reached out and almost touched one, only for it to pirouette in midair and emit a tiny musical note before darting away. She smirked. "They like to dance. You too, if you try that again." The day progressed with a mixture of instruction and whimsy. She demonstrated basic navigation techniques for floating furniture, teaching him to move through rooms without bumping into orbital tables or hovering teacups. Each mistake he made was met with humor, an occasional playful jab, and an ear twitch that conveyed delight more than judgment. She pointed out a corner where the quantum clocks hung, each running at slightly different rates, and when he inquired nervously about what would happen if he touched one, she replied with a grin, "You might age 3 seconds faster or slower, worth it for the view." Lunch was a spectacle. She prepared food that seemed to fold in on itself, simultaneously hot and cold, solid and liquid. He laughed so hard at the absurdity that he nearly forgot to eat, and she joined him in his amusement. "Humans are complicated," she said, "but entertaining. Mostly because you treat everything like it's going to explode, which, frankly, is not entirely wrong." By the afternoon, he began to notice subtle ways in which she observed him. Her ears twitched at his smallest gestures, and she occasionally finished his sentences, not out of impatience but as if she could anticipate his thoughts. The realization unsettled him slightly, but her jokes, about his human predictability, his clumsiness, and the way he stared too long at floating lights, kept the mood light. It was a strange, playful intimacy, like being teased by a friend who knew you better than you knew yourself. Evening arrived with no ceremony, just the gentle shift of light that seemed to have a consciousness of its own. She guided him to a holographic balcony where the stars beyond Zephyr City were visible not as points of light but as swirling, singing constellations. "Ever notice how humans always look up and wonder, but rarely see?" she asked, tilting her head, ears flicking in the cosmic wind. "Try listening, too." He closed his eyes, and faint vibrations tingled in the air around him, patterns of sound and light interweaving in ways that felt alive. He opened one eye to find her watching him, a faint smile playing on her lips. She leaned casually against a floating column, the kind that might have served as a piece of sculpture in another world, and quipped, "You humans have a tendency to make even the simplest experiences complicated. You're doing okay, surprisingly okay." He laughed, a nervous but genuine sound, and realized he was learning something about himself, about trust, about wonder, and about the odd comfort of being guided through a world so alien yet so inviting. Even the floating teacups and singing plants began to feel normal. Somehow, through humor and gentle teasing, she had made him feel at home. As the night deepened, he wondered why she had invited him here, why she had hosted him in a home that seemed to defy reality itself. But before he could articulate the question, she tossed him a glowing fruit and winked. "Don't overthink it," she said, ears twitching in amusement. "I just like having you here." He laughed again, fruit in hand, and realized that perhaps he didn't need to understand yet. Sometimes, he thought, the best way to navigate an alien world was to float along with it, with humor as your guide and curiosity as your compass. And in that moment, sitting beside her amidst levitating plants and the quiet hum of impossible technology, he felt a connection forming, unexpected, strange, and entirely exhilarating. The morning light arrived with a peculiar rhythm, sliding through her home in bands that pulsed like a slow heartbeat. He woke not because of a conventional alarm, but because the light itself seemed to insist, nudging him awake with a soft warmth that carried the faintest hum of music he couldn't quite identify. When he opened his eyes, she was already moving through the space, her long ears twitching in a way that suggested she had been awake for hours, orchestrating some invisible symphony of floating objects. A small spherical drone zipped past, chirping in greeting, and she glanced at him with a mischievous grin. "Good morning. Don't worry, the floor won't bite today," she said. He stumbled out of bed and into the familiar chaos of her home. The gravity fields were more cooperative now, or perhaps he had simply learned to anticipate their whims. He laughed when a cup of coffee hovered briefly before him, wobbling as if indecisive about whether to land or perform an aerial stunt. "You're late," she said with a mock frown, "but I'll allow it. Today's agenda, adventure." He raised an eyebrow. "Adventure?" "Indeed, and don't roll your eyes. You humans have a very distinctive eye roll." "I find it highly amusing," she replied, ears flicking with delight. She led him through a sliding portal that opened onto an external balcony, extending far beyond the conventional bounds of the building. Below, Zephyr City glittered like a river of liquid light, vehicles streaking across the air as if painting invisible murals. "We're going for a little test," she said. "Nothing dangerous, just stimulating." He followed her instructions awkwardly, stepping onto small floating platforms that moved slightly under his weight. Every wobble produced a soft musical note, and he laughed despite himself when one platform spun him gently into a light field, which tickled his skin like invisible feathers. She chuckled beside him. "Humans are remarkably adaptable when bribed with harmless panic," she said, "and remarkably entertained by their own survival instincts." The first part of the day was spent exploring her garden, a bioluminescent ecosystem suspended in a bubble of anti-gravity. Plants spiraled through the air, emitting tiny melodies, and insects with translucent wings circled above, occasionally landing on a leaf to harmonize with the ongoing symphony. He reached out and tried to touch one, only for it to pivot gracefully and sing a note that made him laugh. "Stop, you're intimidating my coordination," he said. She smiled, ears twitching. "Coordination is overrated. Entertainment is underrated." By midday, they had transitioned from the garden to her study, a space where holographic maps of distant star systems rotated lazily in the air. She tapped on one, sending a cluster of stars spinning toward him. "Ever wonder what it's like to visit a star that sings?" she asked. "The notes are dangerous for humans, but enjoyable if you don't overthink it." He tried to imagine the experience, his mind catching glimpses of vibration patterns, light and sound intertwining. She laughed at his struggle. "You think linearly. You need to feel, not think." He realized that the entire experience had subtly shifted him. At the beginning, he had been cautious, hesitant, clumsy, unsure of how to exist in her world. Now he moved with tentative confidence, laughing at his own mistakes, letting the absurdity of floating teacups and singing plants become part of a rhythm he could follow. He caught himself smiling at things he would have dismissed as impossible hours before, and he realized that in letting go, he had gained more than agility. He had gained a perspective, a sense of wonder that hadn't existed in him before. Lunch was a playful exercise in physics and humor. She prepared food that folded in on itself, shifting temperature and form, a challenge to any human notion of practicality. He attempted to take a bite and ended up spinning slightly in midair as a levitating napkin playfully dodged him. She laughed, ears flicking like twin signals of amusement. "You're improving," she said. "Tomorrow, you might even manage a plate without causing a minor spatial anomaly." The afternoon was quiet, punctuated by small jokes, soft teasing, and experiments that felt more like games than lessons. She demonstrated a device that allowed them to manipulate light and sound simultaneously, bending them into patterns that seemed alive. He marveled at how intuitive she was, how she could operate this technology as if it were an extension of her own body. "I see," he said, "how you can read reactions. You notice everything." Her ears twitched. "And you're beginning to notice yourself. Most humans take years to recognize their own rhythms. You're catching on fast and amusingly so." She nudged a floating orb which zipped in circles around his head. "You've learned that it's okay to make mistakes, even delightful mistakes." As evening fell, she guided him to a balcony with a panoramic view of the galaxy beyond the city. Stars shimmered not as distant points, but as swirling constellations, singing faintly in harmony with the hum of her home. He closed his eyes and let the vibrations wash over him, feeling the pulse of the cosmos in a way that defied human comprehension. When he opened his eyes, she was watching him, her expression a mix of amusement and something softer, something profoundly personal. "You've changed," she said, ears flicking as if testing a hidden frequency. "Not in ways humans usually notice, but in ways that matter. You laugh at the absurd, you embrace uncertainty, and you trust." He laughed, embarrassed but sincere. "And you, why did you invite me here? What did you gain?" She tossed him another glowing fruit, one that pulsed softly in his hand. "I gained the chance to see a human in motion, not just surviving but adapting, noticing, and enjoying. And I like having you here. That's enough." The night passed with small, joyful rituals. Floating lights that responded to laughter, tea that sang when stirred, and the quiet companionship of two beings from different worlds learning how to share space and time. He realized he no longer feared the strangeness. He had become part of it, and it had become part of him. When he finally stood to leave the next morning, she walked with him to the edge of her home. "Remember," she said, ears flicking in amusement, "gravity is optional